All right, so welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion of symbols, symbolic thinking, particularly the way symbols work. And so this is part 2 of Sapiens. I apologize that, number 1, it's broken up into 2. I had a little technical glitch there with my computer. Number 2, this video is pretty long, but many of the things that we're fleshing out here are things that are going to develop and reemerge as we go forward in the semester. So some of these key issues about the role of language in human relationships and some of the key aspects of human society are going to be either direct topics of our conversation or important background as we move forward. So let me also say this: when we typically think of friendship, we think in the confines of narrow, private, personal relationships. And we think of it's like enveloped in this kind of privacy that is a deeply personal matter and does not really involve, the public, does not really involve what goes on out there. Now, that absolutely is an important theme of friendship, not to be neglected. But early on in the semester here, what we're trying to get is a big bird's eye view, a 40,000-foot view, so to speak, of how our relationships really fit within the matrix of society, of political life, and then even on the most basic level, evolutionary biology, right? And of course, all the things, all the tools, all the elements, the ingredients that make up those personal, private relationships of intimacy, deep intimacy, are made possible by things we're talking about now. And of course, the irony of private relationships is that everybody is having them, and the central characteristics of them from one person to the next, despite the fact that they're cordoned off by degrees of privacy, is that they're in many ways fundamentally the same. We're aspiring toward the same desires, needs, goals with them, right? And many of these goals are actually the product of these key evolutionary developments. I mean, if we're just talking about biology and boy-girl relationships, we're talking about sex and reproduction, right? And however central that may be to your own personal relationship, as it would be to most people, the real meaning of things like sex and family and reproduction, it does not really come from biology. It really comes from the cultural baggage, the concepts of romance, the concepts of family, the sense of moral obligation that comes with these relationships that give great satisfaction precisely because we feel ourselves committed to something larger than ourselves that is not just a function of biology, but it's a function of the concepts that we create around these relationships, and then we live by them, right? So let's return to our discussion of symbols. So what we're looking at here is how a symbol actually works in its cognitive mechanics. And of course, important observation about a symbol is that it looks, oftentimes, but not always, very different than the thing that it represents. And that's because a symbol does not have to look anything like what it represents. It can be literally an X that is a variable to stand in for all types of content, right? So the flag, American flag, represents innumerable things, and the limit to what it represents is really bounded by your own personal point of view, and there's certain basic understanding of the flags and certain more personal elements, right? But it looks nothing like what it actually represents. So number 1, a symbol is a bit of mental technology. Yes, it's manifest as a physical thing, but it's doing it's inciting a certain type of mental work. And the fact that we might burn this flag, or the fact that we might risk our life to prevent someone burning this flag, lets us know that it's more than just an article of fabric, and that it has deep meanings because it's a symbol. And those meanings are embedded in the symbol when we look at it. Symbol is a repository for ideas. What we're looking at, obviously, is not just shapes, but shapes that signify important consequential ideas that people, for example, are willing to live and die for. Symbols, interesting. I describe them as an external memory drive. They are a repository for ideas that every time we look at this thing, those ideas that are associated with this thing are called to mind through the act of perceiving the symbol, right? So one thing you might ask is, how does this symbol, this flag, become associated with all these meanings? Well, you can think of all the rituals of American life, and here it's going to be American life, in which these meanings are inculcated in us through rituals and habits, right? So first and foremost, we know that this is the flag of the American Republic. We very often, because it's derived from the origins of the nation. Wasn't a flag made in the 19th or 20th century? Well, it is developed in the 19th and 20th century, but the basic structure of the flag has been the same pretty much since the founding of the nation. So when we look at the flag, we don't just think of the nation, we think of its founding, and therefore we think of its core principles, we think of its core documents, and then we might think of more expansive things like the history, certain important historical moments, the founding, the Civil War, the two world wars, the Depression, things of that nature. The way in which the American Republic is understood as fundamentally distinctive for any other type of political regime that emerged on the planet. Slavery. So we can go on ad infinitum of all the things that we believe about it, but at a very early age we're ritualized into these meanings in the same way. You know, my daughter's in a Catholic school right now, and she's learning all the symbology of Catholicism and being told specifically what it means. And you know, the Catholic symbolism is something that if you're not actually familiar with it, you're not likely to grasp all the associations and meanings unless you're actually taught them in some way. So if you think about what happens at a sporting event, what happens when a soldier comes back from the battlefront who's died and they're in a coffin draped with the flag. If you think about what the Pledge of Allegiance is, where we literally recite words while we're looking at the flag. Now, it's not just a sign of respect. So one of the reasons we put the hand over the heart and we look at the flag is it's understood as a sign of respect. But what we're really doing is connecting the visual image of the flag with the words we're saying, and then we're also saying, this is deep in our heart, right? This isn't just a formal thing I'm forced to do. This is something that I deeply believe and am passionate about, right? So just some examples of how the meaning is inculcated. What's the function of symbols? The argument I'm going to make is that symbols are an evolutionary adaptation that made human beings more successful in the game of survival, the game of life as a species. Obviously, they communicate, but one of the primary things symbols communicate is to reflect and to reinforce group identity, right? The reading of the Bible doesn't just help you understand what it means to be a Christian or a Jew, but rather it helps to reinforce the collective identity by a constant reminder of the core passages of the Bible, the core beliefs in the Bible, the core sayings, the core stories that reinforce and relate to your own conduct and therefore to your relationships with others. So symbols, particularly things like flags, because they're of nations, start to establish important and powerful distinctions between us and them, what we are as opposed to somebody else. They establish like-mindedness, harmony, and greater coordination within groups, right? So they're really designed to help foster group identity. Think about the soldier who is willing to die for this flag, or the politician who makes an oath to uphold the Constitution, and this flag in basic ways represents the Constitution, because the Constitution in a sense is the nation and the flag represents the nation. And Aristotle's word for like-mindedness is homonoia. And the expression literally means like-minded. And symbols put us all on the same page as one another. And when they're invoked, there is that collective sameness that is called to mind. So think about, there's a wonderful little anecdote in Sapiens in which, with the development of group identity, out of a created order, out of the created function of language, human beings are able to associate and trust people who are not their own family members or not their own race and what have you, right? You need only think about Malcolm X's autobiography, in which he becomes a Muslim and he goes to Mecca on the pilgrimage that all Muslims are supposed to make at least once in their life, the Hajj, right? And he looks around him, a man who was, geared toward black separatism up to that point. And he looks around him and he sees black, white, yellow, mulatto, all different colors, all different races, worshiping the same God through the same prophet, Muhammad, right? And in that moment, he has this vision of a group identity that can transcend racial and ethnic boundaries. A man who was actually very committed to addressing the problems of blacks in America through separatism, right? Instead of integrating, but separating from American society. So you can't underestimate how powerful these symbols are. Catholicism is really dedicated toward manifesting group identity through all kinds of paintings and sculptures and church ornament that go way beyond the Bible, right? It's very interesting because the Protestant Reformation that happens in the 16th century is really dedicated toward getting rid of those false idols, those graven images, and focusing on the one symbol that really manifests Christian identity for Martin Luther, and that was the text of the Bible itself, the Word of God, and not all the other bells and whistles. But the reason the Catholic Church was so invested in all the ornate pageantry of the Church was because of its power to facilitate group identity. And what happens when you have group identity? You survive better because you coordinate your behavior better. There's more force behind your belief, therefore your actions have more impetus to them, and you have a greater chance of success in the game of life that's chaotic and conflictual and so on. So here I've given you a flag and given you some of my ideas about what this thing might represent. But of course, to each American or each demographic group, there's going to be some different shade of meaning. All that's invested, and all you're seeing is stripes and stars, stars and stripes. 3 different colors, but there's so much really invested in this symbol that is the accretation of our historical development as Americans. Moment, we're going to look at a few passages of the text, and then we'll call it a day. But let the words of the author of Sapiens speak. It's a very powerful statement. He says, Homo sapiens conquered the world thanks above all to language. It wasn't mere brawn, wasn't mere might. It was language that holds with it the medium of symbolic thinking that allows us to start to liberate ourselves, you could say, from the tyranny of nature, and to develop all types of sophisticated technologies that then amplify our own rather limited powers, except this being one of the most powerful, and to do things that we couldn't possibly have done without all those technologies. And that's what's lurking in what he's saying here, on top of the more basic fact that language led to a form of social organization that was much more powerful in crafting group identity and then developing the success of a certain group because of the nature of their group identity. So, if language is the thing that allows us to conquer, what does it do? It obviously communicates to ourselves and others, but it has 2 primary functions, descriptive and creative. And by descriptive, I mean literally it describes the physical world around us, or empirical. Empirical science has to do with the realm of the senses, material attributes of the physical world of the here and now, right? In this role, language is referential, means it refers to physical states of the world that some other person could identify and say, you're talking about that tree over there? Oh, yeah, I see that tree. And tree refers to that physical thing that's there. But there's also a creative power of language, and the author says it creates linguistic fictions or myths. And I think we can overstate the extent to which these things are pure myth or fiction. But what he's clearly indicating is that language creates things that have no tangible existence, that had no clear existence prior to the invocation of the word. So it can create abstract immaterial concepts with no original concrete existence. And the author gives, among other examples, the corporation called Peugeot, which is a fiction of language, but even more specifically a legal fiction, meaning under the rules and the laws you can create this thing called Peugeot that's no longer directly tied to the man Peugeot. It's a corporation in some basic way above and beyond the individual Peugeot that gives him certain types of legal protections. So when, for example, he goes bankrupt, when the company goes bankrupt, he doesn't necessarily personally go bankrupt because of the nature of the laws surrounding corporations. So in a sense, when they say today corporations are not people, they're right in a basic sense, because there's a legal distinction between the two that's important. So it's important to recognize when he talks about this descriptive function of language, he includes in it the threat and the gossip theory. The threat theory being identifying a threat in the immediate environment, and two, the gossip theory, as he calls it, dealing with banter and chit-chat between people, in which what you seem to be doing is just kind of goofing around and passing the time, but what you're really doing is, number one, developing a bond with that person through speech, and number two, you're getting necessary intelligence about your environment that you need to get by in that environment, right? You need, it's like, you know, hey, so-and-so, what do you do about this professor? How do I get the best grade in this class? What do I have to really do? Don't tell me I just have to do my assignments. Tell me something about this professor and what they do. Or tell me about the boss, like what's really going on. If I want to keep my job here, what do I really have to do rather than just good work? And you notice, I mean, for example, in any system of institution, work, school, what have you, often, you know, most of them are good. Often a big portion of it is just your merit, how you work, how well you follow directions and things of that nature. But there's always a kind of X factor that the people there are looking for certain things that they don't always spell out, and you have to figure out what they are if you really want to stay on. And maybe you discover that is not the thing for you, but maybe you discover it is, and you want to meet those kind of unsaid expectations, but that are no less real, despite the fact that they're not said. So then language is also creative. Language is also creative. It has the power to create an imagined order. What did I say an imagined order is? It is an order of ideas, a constellation of ideas, because ideas always exist in an interconnected way. So you can talk about the American Republic. We have but within that we have ideas of freedom. We have the Constitution. We have the equality of all mankind. We have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of these exist within the constellation of the American Republic, and all of them are concepts that are rather immaterial, but that are made quite real when we manifest a government, and then it manifests a society, and we live a certain way in relationship to those ideas. Those ideas become instantiated. They become real. So descriptive. So what's a good example here? Just have the newspaper. But in our modern world, you know, the newspaper is really the epitome of descriptive language. That what was the very idea of the news? You wake up in the morning and you get the paper, and the paper tells you, this is the state of the world today. This is what's going on at this minute, physically. And of course it may be what governments do and so on and so forth, but there's still a tangible reality to it all. Whereas if you look at the, here I've got a little image of, is that the Declaration or is that the Constitution? It's the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The Constitution, it's interesting. In 1787, all the leading statesmen, or many of the leading statesmen of the United States, because of course we're an independent nation there, we don't have the Constitution, but we had separated ourselves from England in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. We have a nation, and they sit down to craft a document to bring into existence an almost completely new form of national government. They write the Constitution. It's got 7, 8 articles to it, right, that describes and defines the structure of the new government. The interesting thing is that at the time they're writing this government does not exist. It does not exist almost at all, right? There's some lingering elements, things taken from the Articles of Confederation, things taken from the states' constitutions, but it doesn't exist. So it's all just words, right? And then finally, 1789 and 1790, this government is literally brought into existence from the words, and it is made real, it is made tangible. And I mean, today when we think of government, we don't think of just the words of the Constitution, however important we find them to be, but it's physical institutions that are are supposed to be, of course there's a lot of problems in our government, supposed to be the manifestation of the words, right? So the words are literally made real, or we might even say made incarnate, made flesh. And so the key thing here is that this is an example of an imagined order. The Constitution in 1787 is, in a sense, a work of the imagination, right? Based on lots of real experience. It's not imagination in the sense of science fiction, but it has, the government described does not exist. It's imagination. The text itself defines an imagined order of government. But then guess what? That imagined order is instantiated and made into a political system, to a government, into a regime that's made real. So the imagined order of the concepts and ideas gets made manifest in an actual political order. Important to see that. So the key thing for Sapiens, for our purposes in this book, is to see the transformation of human society from when it's primarily based on descriptive language alone to a society that's really built and founded on the creative function of language. So if you think about it, I mean, the most of the initial concepts, imagine we're in a state where human beings, they have body language and they have grunts and barks and things like that, or whatever human beings did. In the process of the thousands of years that it takes to develop language in response to the environment and to actualize the potentials that, natural selection gives us, the first words you would think would be primary descriptive things about the physical world because they have the most kind of palpable impact on us, right? And over time, it would seem that the later concepts to develop would be these creative concepts that are ones that have no tangible existence and create entities that don't exist in the physical world, so it's no longer referential or representational. The story that the author of Sapiens is telling here is one in which, when we get the full power of creative language as applied to group identity, we are able to establish fundamentally different types of human groupings on the face of the planet. And he's going to walk through some steps as to this development so we can really see some of the implications of it. So I'm going to read through and comment briefly on some of these important passages. And just a note here that the PDF that I've provided you of the text is slightly different from the version that I have posted here in terms of its pagination. But the order is the same. So if you just follow the chapter headings, you should be fine. So here we're looking at page 21 of the text I gave you. And so we're looking at this transformation of social organization as it moves and shifts from being based on descriptive language to creative language. So he says the appearance of new ways of thinking and communicating between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago constitutes the cognitive revolution. What caused it? We're not sure. The most commonly believed theory argues that accidental genetic mutations changed the inner wiring of the brain of Homo sapiens, enabling them to think in unprecedented ways and to communicate using an altogether new type of language. We might call it the tree of knowledge mutation, Why did it occur in Sapiens DNA rather than Neanderthals? It was a matter of pure chance as far as we can tell. But it's more important to understand the consequences of the tree of knowledge mutation than its causes. The consequences, and here we're looking at the consequences on social organization as a result of a new type of communication. What was so special about the new Sapiens language that it enabled us to conquer the world? It was not the first language. Every animal has some kind of language. Insects, such as bees and ants, know how to communicate in sophisticated ways, informing one another of the whereabouts of food. Neither was it the first vocal language. Many animals, including all ape and monkey species, have vocal language. For example, green monkeys use calls of various types to communicate. Zoologists have identified one of the calls as meaning careful, an eagle. A slightly different call warns careful, a lion. So notice a couple things about these forms of communication. They're largely onomatopoetic, meaning the sound is the same as is connected with the meaning exclusively. And number two, there's a very simple grammar. There's careful or attention and eagle, right? So simple grammatic structure there in terms of vocabulary and also in terms of grammar. And then we notice that we're going to discover that these expressions are only used in the presence or when they think they're in the presence of an eagle or lion. They're not going to sit around at the water cooler and talk about what they could do about that lion in future days to fend him off so that they don't have to have these spontaneous reactions each time he appears. A slightly different call warns careful, a lion. When researchers played a recording of the first call to monkeys of groups, the monkeys stopped what they were doing and looked upward in fear. So here's the thing. When they hear this expression, they don't hear a discussion of an eagle or lion in general, in this case an eagle because they're looking up. They assume the immediate presence of the thing, right? So there's no displacement for them, which is talking about things that are not present. When the same group heard a recording of the second, the lion warning, they quickly scrambled up a tree. Sapiens can produce many more distinct sounds than green monkeys, but whales and elephants have equally impressive abilities. A parrot can say anything Albert Einstein could say, as well as mimicking the sounds of phones ringing, doors slamming, and sirens wailing. Whatever advantage Einstein had over a parrot, it wasn't vocal. What was it? It was the ability to think symbolically. E equals mc squared. That's the famous Einstein's famous formula. The parrot can say that. It's probably a very easy thing for a parrot to say. The problem is, doesn't know what it means, right? And what does it mean to say that the parrot doesn't know what it means? Well, he doesn't understand that those sounds that he's making are just symbols or stand-ins or that represent other things. So we know that the E equals energy, M equals mass, C equals the speed of light. The parrot's not going to be able to get any of that. The 2 is speed of light squared. And then we see that the M next to the C means multiply. And then we see that all that together equals energy, right? And then we also understand, this is important, that what we have is not just some made-up equation, but that this equation represents an actual phenomena in the real world, in the physical reality of things, right? And that it's a kind of simplified way of illustrating that actual phenomena that is the relationship between energy, mass, and the speed of light that exists in reality. You could put it that way. And the symbolic representation is a shorthand to simply communicate that reality in a convenient way that can be manipulated for whatever it means by the scientist, right? And for the parrot, it's just hearing E equals mc squared, and that's it. And that's it. No meaning. No meaning. Why? Because the parrot may have brilliant vocal cords, but he does not have the parts of the brain that allow for symbolic thought in which a symbol is actually just a stand-in for something else that, get this, is not actually present, right? Not actually present or immediately observable. The most common answer is that our language is amazingly supple. We can connect a limited number of sounds and signs to produce an infinite number of sentences, each with a distinct meaning. We can thereby ingest, store, and communicate a prodigious amount of information about the surrounding world. So here we're talking about descriptive language about the surrounding world. A green monkey can yell to its comrades, "Careful, a lion," but a modern human can tell her friend that this morning, near the bend in the river, she saw a lion tracking a herd of bison. Now notice how different quantitatively and qualitatively this statement is from what the monkey... When we have this example of monkey saying, "Careful, a lion," I think what it's supposed to be is it's supposed to be indicative of the types of communication they're capable of, right? Which is to say, they can deal with something in their immediate presence and say, "Attention, fear for your life, get moving, it's a lion." So you go up the tree rather than look up, because you're not going to protect yourself looking up for the lion, right? But the modern human, which means Homo sapien, it doesn't necessarily mean someone from the 20th century or something like that, right? She said that this morning, near a bend in the river, she saw a lion tracking a herd of bison. Now, "Careful, a lion," the implication is go and protect yourself and do whatever monkeys do to protect themselves. She's giving us information about the lion, right? But she's not just saying, "Careful, a lion." She's telling you where it is. She's telling you when she saw it. She's acknowledging that I saw it this morning and that I don't see it now. And she's also describing exactly, precisely what it's doing. All these things that the monkey apparently can't do. Let's just say that. And then the question is, why is she telling? Is she saying, "Careful, a lion, beware when you go down by the river"? Or is she saying, well, gee, there's a herd of bison there too. Maybe if we can deal with the lion appropriately, we can get the bison and have them for dinner or some such. She's got concepts of time, place, sophisticated verbs to describe what they're doing. Time and place are physical things, but we need concepts to be able to represent them. Without concepts, it's like the concept of death. Animals, I mean, they must have some instinctual built in that they're mortal beings and that they're different from rocks and trees, right? But they don't have a concept of death, so therefore they don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh my God, I'm going to die one day, what shall I do?" And for example, Heidegger will say that human beings live their life in part based on a fundamental awareness that they're going to die, and therefore their awareness of death shapes their actions and their thoughts and makes them live a certain way because they're aware of it in a way that other animals aren't. You may disagree with it, that that's the defining thing of our lives or our cognitive and mental lives, but clearly that's obviously really important. We're all aware that our time is finite, right? A lion's time is finite, but they're not thinking about that, and therefore they can't make decisions based on it. He says a second theory argues that our unique language evolved as a means of sharing information about the world, but the most important information that needed to be conveyed was about humans and not about lions. So here we move from the threat theory to the gossip theory. Because since we live in a human-created society, since we live in a world, I think we need to move forward here. Since we live in a world that is defined by a realm of human creation, the thing we need to conquer is not the elements of the natural world, but it's the elements of human society, including other human beings and their personalities. We need to know what's going on with them, right? And so he says, but the most important information that needed to be conveyed was about humans, not about lions and bison. Our language evolved as a way of gossiping. According to this theory, Homo sapiens is primarily a social animal Social cooperation is key for our survival and reproduction. It is not enough for individual men and women to know the whereabouts of lion and bison. What's more important for them to know is who in the band hates whom, who is sleeping with whom, who is honest, and who is a cheat. So here's the thing. Human beings have an appearance and a reality behind it. Human beings are constantly contriving an appearance to us. Why do we have to chit-chat about other people to learn things about them? It means that their own words and their own actions as displayed to us does not fully reveal their true nature and their true conduct. Right? Notice what gossip is. It's two people, it's almost always two people, talking about some third party, and the third party is not present. Why? Because if you ask that third party directly, or if they were pleasant, you wouldn't be able to talk about it. You wouldn't be able to be honest for all kinds of different reasons. But you couldn't go up to a cheat, right? Say, excuse me, sir, are you a cheat? I said, well, of course I am. You better watch out for me because I'm going to cheat you any moment, right? What does a cheat rely on? A cheat relies on your belief that they are not a cheat, right? That they're a good person, or at least you don't know that they're a bad person. And therefore they get you in their confidence and then they take advantage of you, right? So you can't learn, the examples here are carefully chosen. Who is sleeping with whom? Why do you not know that? Because sex is one of the most powerful, emotionally laden, potentially conflictual topics that could be discussed. And the reason it doesn't produce conflict when it doesn't is because we keep it off to the side, locked in a box, away from the jealousy and provocation that it might invoke if we talked about it openly, right? So sex turns out to be a highly controversial, it's interesting, it's a controversial topic, and because it's controversial, because it's private, but if we think about why it's private because it's controversial, we don't talk about these things with anybody. And yet, when we're in a world of work or school or what have you, we need to know certain things. We need to know it. You got to know the score. You got to know what's going on to know how to deal with certain situations and certain people. But you can't just go up and ask them. So therefore, gossip. And therefore, gossip for this author is actually a form of intelligence gathering, not just kind of shooting the breeze, that becomes vital to our getting by in the game of life, which is no longer about fending off the external elements of like wind and rain, but of dealing with other human beings in human society. So here's where it gets interesting. Now, the author of Sapiens is going to transition to a discussion of how a society built on descriptive language is going to be fundamentally different than a society built on the creative function of language. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. The amount of information that one must obtain and store in order to track the ever-changing relationships of even a few dozen individuals is staggering. In a band of 50 individuals, there are 1,225 one-on-one relationships. The one person with the other, and the other person with it, and the one person with everybody else, right? And if you add them all up, you get all these relationships from both perspectives. Mine to you, and you to me, and myself to everyone else. And the countless more complex social combinations. All apes show a keen interest in such social information, but they have trouble gossiping effectively. Neanderthals and archaic Homo sapiens probably also had a hard time talking behind each other's backs, a much maligned ability which is in fact essential for cooperation in large numbers. And he says this, so with what he's really saying when he says gossip here and this band of 50, he's saying the descriptive function of language can only hold a community together that is rather small and have it actually function because there's just too much information to keep track of. What you're going to need is the creative function of language to bring your community under core concepts, imaginary concepts by which you live, right? He says the new linguistic skill that modern sapiens acquired about 70 millennia ago enabled them to gossip, for hours on end. Reliable information about who could be trusted meant that the small bands could expand into larger bands, and sapiens could develop tighter and more sophisticated types of cooperation. So here you see the direct consequence of the descriptive function of language as it manifests in gossip. And gossip you might just think of as the news. What is the newspaper but a fancy gossip rag for the elites? The gossip theory might sound like a joke, but numerous studies support it. Even today, the vast majority of human communications, whether in form of emails, phone calls, newspaper columns, is gossip. It comes so naturally to us that it seems as if our language evolved for this very purpose. Do you think that history professors chat about the reasons for World War I when they meet for lunch, or that nuclear physicists spend their coffee breaks at scientific conferences talking about quarks? Oh no. Sometimes, but more often they're gossiping about the professor who caught her husband cheating, or a quarrel between the head of the department and the dean, or the rumors that a colleague used his research funds to buy a Lexus. That's the real world for you. Gossip usually focuses on wrongdoings, rumor mongering, because everybody presents themselves as good, right? Even the bad guys, and especially the bad guys, are determined to present themselves as good. So getting that information about the naughty actions of mankind becomes more challenging. And if people use deception to conceal their naughtiness, then we have to use special tactics of intelligence gathering called gossip to learn about it. And one of the problems of being an innocent, decent person is that you don't know evil or bad behavior firsthand, right? I mean, if you're a Christian, everybody's a sinner. No, everybody's imperfect. Everybody commits little transgressions. But I'm talking when you start to get to serious transgressions, most of us have not committed really serious transgressions. And the problem, and this is going to be another theme of our course as we segue into the moral component that deals with human relationships built on issues of right and wrong, is that the innocent person, since they haven't done the crime, they don't know it. They're not familiar with it. They can't imagine people would do that stuff, right? And so therefore, when they look at other people and those people conceal their bad behavior, they can't see through it because they're not looking for it to begin with, because they can't imagine that other people would do it. But, we talked about in Mending Wall that there's this vision of wanting to view the world that we don't need boundaries, don't need laws, don't need the police force, that we can defund it. We can all live in a utopia and can't we all just get along, right? So the neighbor who says good fences making good neighbors, well, one of them could say it because that's what his daddy said. But another could say it because he could say, well, guess what? I've seen what human nature is really capable of. Not everybody is capable of such bad things, and probably most people aren't. But there are a few bad eggs in the dozen, and I'm not going to be their victim, so I'm going to build this wall, and we're going to keep it here, and it's going to benefit everyone at the end of the day, right? So we see that we're starting to see that this text is great for the interfacing of a lot of important themes in this course. It says, gossip usually focuses on wrongdoing. Rumor mongers are the original fourth estate, meaning journalists, right, reporting, who inform society about and thus protect it from cheats and freeloaders. One of the core functions of the freedom of the press in our country, which basically gives birth to the media and journalism, is to expose and make transparent to the people the workings of government, so that when there are problems, that we can actually take action to try to rectify them. Obviously, the key observation that if the workings of government are concealed and they're doing bad things against the very people they're supposed to represent, and we don't know about it, it's tough enough to act when you do know about something, but when you don't know about something, you're not even going to be aware that there's something you need to take action on, right? He goes on, legends, myths, and gods appeared for the first time with the cognitive revolution. Legends, myths, and religions. Why? because the cognitive revolution brings about symbolic thinking and the creation of creative language, bringing things into existence that didn't exist in tangible form. That's crucial. Many animals and human species could previously have said, "Careful, lion," but thanks to the cognitive revolution, Homo sapiens acquired the ability to say, "The lion is the guardian spirit of our tribe." Now, there's many elements of the creative function of language here. The first and foremost is that this statement seems to be part of a kind of civic religion, which is to say the religion of the state. In a modern world, we have the separation of church and state, but that very self-conscious distinction, that decision was brought about by thousands of years of human civilization in which all regimes were various types of theocracies, in which there was no distinction between religion and the state. And for example, the king or the primary leader was often understood as the head of the church or of the religion, if not a divine or semi-divine figure themselves. Right, so religion. The second thing is, the lion is the guardian spirit of our tribe. First of all, this is not a physical lion. And instead of seeing this lion in a pen in a zoo, this lion is going to be depicted in sculpture, in art, as the kind of mascot of their society, right? And this lion is a concept. This lion is not a physical, actual biological animal anymore. And what is it? It's the guardian spirit. It's the deity of some kind, or spirit, that looks over our people and protects us. And then last, our tribe. Now, tribes are extended families, right? Tribal existence, as distinct from political existence, is defined by living amongst people who are of your biological relations. And of course, for most of human history, people have lived and defined their communities by their blood relationships, ties of kinship, right? So that's what a tribe is, or clan, same idea. But to identify something as a tribe, as a distinct community, you're already using, to say our tribe, you're already using a concept of the creative function of language here. He says this ability to speak about fictions, whether it's the lion as guardian spirit of our tribe, our ability to speak about fictions is the most unique feature of sapiens language. It's relatively easy to agree that Homo sapien can speak about things that don't really exist and believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. You could never convince a monkey to give you a banana by promising him limitless bananas after death in monkey heaven. But why is it important? After all, fiction can be dangerous, misleading, or distracting. People who go to the forest looking for fairies and unicorns would seem to have less of a chance in the game of survival than people going looking for mushrooms and deer. So he gives the example of life after death. And of course, in almost all major world religions, and Christianity being the one we think about most specifically, but it's in almost all religions in some form, there is some concept of life after death. And the question is, if this is such a silly fiction, why did it manifest in society and become such a pervasive belief? Less so in modern times, but in pre-modern times it's common. And the point is, what is the function of it? And the function of life after death, if you look at it from a scientific, so clearly the author here is looking at religion from a scientific and historical point of view rather than the point of view of a believer. So we have to make that distinction. Life after death serves the function of good people get rewarded and bad people get punished, right? So even if in society you didn't get rewarded or punished as was befitting your conduct, you're going to get punished someday, and God sees you doing it, right? So the police, right? Part of society is having a police force to keep everybody in line, or something equivalent thereof. And religion is really the first great kind of cognitive police force. You could call it, in a slightly pejorative way, mind control, in that when the police can't see you, God can, and he will see your good conduct or bad, and you will be rewarded or punished accordingly. So even if the police force didn't see your bad conduct and you got away and didn't get punished, you're going to be punished in the future. So you better straighten out. And when we look at the Republic, we're going to see initially a character who's highly conflicted, who spent his life doing many naughty things, thinking there's no consequences because he got away with them, and all of a sudden he's about to die, and he's become all of a sudden afraid of the afterlife and being punished. And it implies immediately that he thinks, and probably has, by the normal standards of morality of his society, he's probably done something wrong, and he doesn't want to be punished, right? So what does that fiction, so-called, do? It keeps social order. It keeps harmony. He says, and if you spend hours praying to non-existent guardian spirits, aren't you wasting precious time? Time better spent foraging, fighting, and fornicating? And the answer is not necessarily. See, the scientific point of view will immediately dismiss fictions as, since they're not true in the literal sense, they're meaningless. But the author here is acknowledging that there is a salutary benefit to these fictions if they're of, the kind that turns out to be beneficial. But fiction has enabled us and we all live by fictions, regardless of who we are. But fiction has enabled us not merely to imagine things, but to do so collectively. We can weave common myths such as biblical creation stories, the daytime myths of Aboriginal Australians, and the nationalist myth of modern states. Such myths give sapiens the unprecedented ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. So that's the difference here, that we can live in a much larger, more complex society as a result of these collective myths that we're all living by that help us to coordinate and harmonize our behavior. So it says ants and bees can also work together in huge numbers, but they do so in a very rigid manner and only with close relatives, tribal. Wolves and chimpanzees cooperate far more flexibly than ants, but they can only do so with small numbers of other individuals who they know intimately. Sapiens can cooperate in extremely flexible ways with countless numbers of strangers. That's why sapiens rule the world, whereas ants eat our leftovers and chimps are locked in zoos and research laboratories, just to put a sharp point on it. So you see here, perhaps the best example of this is a place like New York City, where every time you go out the door, the people you ever see is strangers, and yet you're not in conflict with them. If you lived in a tribal society, anybody who wasn't a family member would be someone you didn't recognize, and therefore they would be likely seen as either an enemy or certainly a potential enemy. I'm not going to read through it, but I just want to make a note that this story of Pujo, first of all, picks up on this concept of the lion as a symbol now. We started out with careful the lion, then we went to the tribal spirit, guardian spirit, the lion, and now we're talking about the Pujo lion. And the whole idea here is that this symbol is a representative of a corporation, which is itself a legal fiction that starts out as a guy's name, Pujo, that's his last name. And then he lends his name to a corporation which no longer refers to him physically, but to a legal fiction. And then the legal fiction creates a whole business with factories and sales and marketing and so on and so forth. That is a manifestation of an imagined order that starts with those legal documents and the very legal concept of a corporation that creates it. And I'm not going to go into every last detail here, but the analysis here can be applied to any type of imagined order. I already mentioned the Constitution as it manifests in the United States. So we conclude our discussion here. We round third and head for home with a discussion of the agricultural revolution, in which techniques of living, aka farming, extracting resources, food, calories from the environment, merge with our powers of symbolic thinking to create human, not just culture, but civilization. You might say the emerging and ongoing perfection of the human animal by creating an artificial environment called town and country, or city and farmlands, outside of the city, that is the expression of this initial genetic mutation to its fullest extent, where we manifest all our powers and attributes, and in particular manifest really special types of social, political relationships that are made possible by symbolic thinking coupled with these development in ways of living, right? So the agricultural revolution starts about 10,000 years, 10,000, 12,000 years ago and goes to 4,000 BC. It is the first definitive moment in which human beings start to systematically create dominion over nature and conquer it. So if you think about when Adam and Eve are created in the Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve are given dominion over the earth, control over the earth. Now, the reality is, God didn't really give us that, but to the extent that we have developed this control, we have made it out of these historical developments, right? Agriculture involves controlling the cycles of nature in terms of planting and harvesting, of irrigation, of creating canals. So not only are we helping to control or piggyback on the cycles of nature, we're starting to intervene in our environment to shape it to our own ends and own purposes, what is going to be called in the 17th century the conquest of nature. In the 17th century, there's something called the scientific revolution, where it's supposed to be, we all think of it in terms of the development of the scientific method in modern natural science. But the underlying impulse for all that scientific discovery was one thing: control over our natural environment, and also control over ourselves, right? The modern technological, technocratic world, right? Because by controlling the environment, we are less at the mercy of nature, which is, not our mother, but our stepmother. She doesn't completely love us. She cares about us to a certain extent, and then to a certain large extent, she's indifferent. So we have to take care of our own business. So we get farming, we get the domestication of plants and animals, which is genetic engineering. We're literally starting to manipulate the building blocks of nature through genetic engineering. Not done in a lab, but grafting plants and breeding animals and stuff like that. There's a division of town and country. We typically think of city and rural as two isolated and distinct phenomena, but actually they go together. You cannot have cities in people living tooth and jowl in close quarters, tens of thousands of people, unless you have farmers producing their food. Because what are those people in the cities doing? They're not farming because they don't have any farmland there. I know we want to grow our vegetables in like our back victory garden behind our apartment and stuff, but it's not really feasible for 99.9% of people living in cities. So urban dwellers are merchants, priests, bureaucrats, artisans, in that specialization of labor with the arts and sciences and the crafts. And then the farmers are living out, providing the surplus food, not just for their own families, but surplus for the people in the city. And things like bread and things like beer, various types of bread and beer, become the basis of the culinary life. You get the birth of the concept of home, because the soil, right? The Germans had an expression, it's unfortunately tainted by Nazism, of blood and soil, which what matters about our nation is our blood relationships and the soil we live on. And why do we care about the soil? Because until very recently, all human beings have been farmers, and it's that soil that kept us alive, right? And normally the relationship was you pray to your God for a good harvest, and if you act right in relationship to God, God yields the bounty that allows you to maybe survive, but maybe even flourish and have all the trappings of civilization. So with this, you get a profound, complex structure, profoundly complex structure of society. Society becomes a very highly organized system with a division of specialization of labor. And by everybody specializing, it allows them to develop their own profession or their own discipline in a highly complex and sophisticated way, because they're not having to learn how to do everything. They're not a jack of all trades and master of none. Now they can master something by taking up just one profession, This facilitates trade and the development of money and various types of banking instruments. Why? Because you make your thing and someone else makes another thing, and the barter system does not allow for the ideal allocation of resources. If you have money as a stand-in for resources, then you can take the money and buy what you need with it rather than just what they're selling. You get a large stratification of rich and poor in society, and the emergence of slavery actually comes with civilization. In many ways, civilization is built on slavery because the elite classes are also the leisured classes. They have time to do other things than work with their hands in the fields. And it's the slaves, it's the serfs, it's the rentiers who are confined to manual labor, confined to the land, where the elites are, in a sense, parasitically living off the work of those people, and they're able to engage in other things. So there's a profound trade-off in this, a great inequality that's established, and of course not all professions are paid equally. Some are more important to society than others, and the most important, you get more monetary reward, right? So you get this massive division of labor and also of a divide of wealth, the stratified wealth, the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and the 99%. And the 1% are going to become a kind of a nobility. That's a bloodline nobility. They're going to become the kings, the lords, and the priests of the society, and they're going to run the political and religious structure in maintaining that order over the people. So here are just some examples of the first known urban developments, and you immediately see the effect of urban life, of people living tooth and jowl on top of one another. I mean, just visually, it starts to look like a community, despite the fact that a community is not just about geography, but core beliefs held in common, right? And the other thing is, you see how we're starting to live in a man-made world. If you look, while this development at Katul Huyuk, it's called, in Turkey, what you do notice is it's increasingly on right angles and a grid pattern, right? Just like New York City, just like Manhattan. Not the Bronx and not Brooklyn, right? Not Queens. They're a little messier. But the key thing is, you see the imposition of the human mind on the landscape in this kind of right angle organization, which you find in man-made things and not natural things. Other examples in this complex, you see paintings of human beings hunting animals. That's nothing surprising. But what you notice about the depictions is that it's a group of hunters that are working in a coordinated and systematic way to hunt the animals through, by using cooperation and maybe some training in advance, they can be more effective in hunting the animals as a group, where each of them themselves has a division of labor within the hunting group to most effectively catch the animals. It's like a football team going out there that's practiced and that has a game plan versus just a bunch of people say, boy, I'm hungry, let's go kill an animal. You're not likely to be very successful like that. The agricultural revolution brings about the birth of politics, and this is really important. The fundamental distinction you could make at this stage is the distinction between a society that's based on tribal or family or blood relationships, we're all descended from the same ancestor, versus the one based on politics, in which you have a city-state, a city that is its own political entity, right? With tens of thousands of people who are effectively strangers. They don't come from the same family. They don't have the same last name. But what they're all going to be forced to do, among other things, is to recognize the same government and to recognize the same gods if they want to live in that city. And that's going to create cohesion, right? So a political community is a community of strangers, I'm saying, meaning they're not bound by blood. Could be 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 people, very different ancient cities you want to look at. And therefore, all these strangers who are not related by blood, what they needed was a powerful centralized government to impose authority on them because of the natural conflict that is endemic in the boundaries between my family and your family, this tribe and that tribe. So basically you have many tribes living in the city. And these early forms at government, centralized government, very sophisticated in Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East, used an almost despotic level of control. They were very forceful because they had a lot of people for the first time in human history that they needed to conform to right conduct in order for the political or the social organization to maintain itself. And religion becomes one of the central focuses in terms of social control and organization. So, one of the examples that your author gives you about, as an example of an imagined order, is Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code. And the question is, how does Hammurabi's Code, and this is called the stele that has Hammurabi's Code on it, how does it all work? Well, the first thing is, you have a system of laws that you claim don't come just from you, but come from a god. So here, this is ancient Babylon, right? Ancient Mesopotamia. And here you have Hammurabi, the leader of the Babylonians, and he's in what's called an introduction scene with the main god, their civic deity that they worship in Babylon. He's a sun god, or some identify him as Shamash. He's got these like flames coming out of his wings, and he's got a horned helmet of royal authority, and he's sitting on a throne, and he's seated where Hammurabi is standing. So there's a distinction between the divine and the mortal here, right? And below this introduction scene, you'll see all this cuneiform writing, which are actually the law code of Hammurabi, which are actually like rulings that become precedents as of law for society, right? And the big motive for this image at the top of the stele, right, is to demonstrate the true source of the laws. So what Hammurabi is saying is these laws, or these rulings, kind of judicial rulings that I have made when a problem has arisen in society, when a crime has been committed, they actually didn't come from me, they came from God, right? Just like Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, he says, me? I didn't make them, they came from the guy upstairs. And you can ask yourself, what's the motivation for claiming that laws are not man-made, but made by God? In America, it's explicitly acknowledged laws are man-made. We see them on C-SPAN, on the floor of the House and Senate, making laws. And it's acknowledged that those are the guys, our representatives, are making the laws. Here, the God has made an eternal law for us to live by. Why? One, people are naturally going to say the law must be good because it doesn't come from you, it comes from a God. It displaces your own authority and your own sense of interest. People are going to say, oh, you're not just making these laws to benefit yourself, a theme we're going to look at later, is going to say, oh, the God who looks after our city has made these laws for our own collective benefit, right? Furthermore, what can gods do? They can punish you. They can see you at all times, right? So you can't escape the wrath of a god the way you could escape the wrath of a mere mortal. Thing as we wrap up here is, out of this symbolic power of language to create entities that have no natural existence, we get the emergence of political community and a religious order, the two of which are intertwined in the ancient world in the form of theocracy, which means rule by religion, in which the leader of the nation is not just the president or the leader politically, but they are also the primary priest, often described as priest kings, and that they were the beings that had the fundamental access to the God and were essentially like prophets in ministering to their people the word and will of the gods through them. And each city-state in the ancient world had some form of a civic or patron deity, the primary deity that they believed looked after them, that was the cause of their existence, and that if they wanted to live successfully as a society, they had to pay homage to that god, because when bad things happened, lose a war, famine, rape and pillage of their society, the conclusion was obvious, that they had done something to anger the gods, and therefore they were being punished by the gods. So the last interesting thing we see here is that Hammurabi is being set up as a priest king and given by this god Shamash the tools to rule and govern society. He's given a rod and a rope. And these two things, they are the attributes of a master architect and builder, and they are literally the tools, some of the tools that they would use in order to build a architectural edifice, an artificial structure. So this is a metaphor. So Hammurabi is an architect, and the question is, what is he an architect of? Right? He's not an architect of a building, because he's much more than that. He's the architect of what? A whole society. Or we might say even more precisely, he's the architect of a people and their way of life. And then the question is, if he's an architect of the people and a way of life as a political ruler and a religious ruler, what are the tools that he uses as a politician or as a priest to rule, shape, and define the lives of his citizens, right? Or his subjects, as the case may be. And the answer is, it's his laws. Because what are the laws? They are fences which restrain and shape human conduct individually and then obviously collectively, because the whole idea of a law is that it's applied to everyone, and shapes their interactions. And if you think about like the fundamental necessity of law is not just because people want to impose their will on other people, that's not unimportant, but that you can't have a sophisticated and highly functioning society unless you establish certain baseline rules that inhibit certain impulses in people that would have them do things that are contrary to the collective good. So the laws are manifestations of this tension between our own natural interest or our natural impulses versus the demands and needs of the collective good, which are historically understood to be in conflict with one another because they're not perfectly in alignment. What we want for a person is not necessarily to do our duty by our fellow citizens or our fellow neighbors, right? And where do we see those laws? We see them right here. And when you read Sapiens, you can see some of the examples of the implications of those laws, and you can very quickly see how those examples would manifest in order and harmony of society. The punishments are extreme, and some of them you're all familiar with from the Bible, like an eye for an eye, and so on and so forth, right? So what do these laws do? They're a creative function of language, and they impose on society an order that allows them to coexist peacefully. So what do we see here? We see a theme, however lurking, of mending wall, that the rules of society, the laws, in this case, we're Moses here, they come from God. They're going to bring order and harmony on society and success in however we envision it, because the rules are going to inhibit those things that are conflictual with our collective good, and it acknowledges that human beings have impulses that are contrary to our fellow neighbor and to the collective good, right? That's really crucial. We're not quite saying that human beings are intrinsically evil, but we are saying that they have certain imperfections, or that there's just a chink in the logic of human nature, in that what we desire individually does not simply harmonize with what we need collectively. It's an interesting problem. So with that, we shall call it a day. Thank you very much.